Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and today I'm going to talk about abilities. And hopefully, for like the next 2 months, I'll talk about abilities quite a bit because I want to do a series talking about the abilities that matter in Warcry. Now, what do I mean by that? When I say cynical sounding things like it matters at all, sometimes people get sort of their hackles raised up if I say that, this ability that you care about a lot, it doesn't make the list. I didn't want to be nailed down by a specific top 10 list. Sometimes you say the top 10 abilities in the game at some category, and there's really 9 that you care about and then 3 that you almost care about, something like that. So it'd make more sense to put it at 9 or 13, something like that. That's where I'm at with this. I just want to talk about the abilities that really set the pace of games, that really correlate to winning games in a lot of situations. There's all sorts of abilities in the game where you will win a game one time because you got it in the one time it was really good. But I want to talk about those abilities that are good pretty much every single game that then sort of end up affecting the entire game of Warcry just by their existence, because there's a few of them, and I don't know if everybody knows about all of them. So I thought it was worth talking about. I'm also excited that this video is going to be on the New York Times of Warhammer, which is Goonhammer. So happy to have joined their network and happy to post this on their site. Now, when I evaluate abilities, what do I go off of? And you can kind of talk about it in a few different ways. One is you can talk about it in relative terms. There are universal abilities that everyone gets, and Onslaught and Rampage, which are the universal double that boosts attacks, and the universal quad that gives you 2 actions and ruins your opponent's life. Those have, through the history of Warcry, those have sort of formed the structure of the game. I don't use Onslaught every game, but I use it almost every game. I don't use Rampage every game, but I wish I could use it every game. And so these really sort of create the benchmark for the game. And so you can really evaluate abilities based on how they compare to those two. Would you ever spend your dice on this faction ability instead of these universal abilities? I know some folks feel like if the universal abilities are too good, that's just a really bad thing, crowding out individual abilities. I'm very sympathetic to that view. The one thing I would say in defense of Onslaught and Rampaging being so good is that they kind of set this basis for what happens in a game that anything else is a deviation from, and they are fun, right? Like Onslaught is a fun ability, Rampage is a fun ability. They're both very well designed, and so to have them be the 2 abilities that kind of undergird the entire structure of Warcry is not the end of the world. The other thing you can do to evaluate abilities as your sort of relative point is the metagame, what you plan to face and what they're casting, which I think is very relevant, and I will get to throughout this ability as I talk about kind of the metagame defining factions and abilities in order. What goes into it, though, is very important to me because there's more than each ability kind of has more than meets the eye to it when you think about a few different things. So the first is output, whether it's damage or movement or points, or and by points I mean like points in the mission, or whether it's scalable. So for example, if your ability just says you get a bonus attack, that's sort of equivalent in some ways to just saying do X damage and your attack ends up doing X damage. But they're different in other ways too, right? Because the one where you give a bonus attack is more scalable as fighters get bigger, but the one that just does X damage is more scalable as your opposing fighters get tougher. Essentially, as your opposing fighters get higher and higher toughness, that damage essentially scales to that toughness because you are piercing through more points worth of armor that the opposing fighter is paying for, essentially. So it matters quite a bit in context then which type of thing you're using there. The other, and this is the thing that abilities don't actually have printed on them, but matters a lot, is the setup. Some of it is just the range of abilities, which is printed, but there's also like the list building costs. How easy is it to get this fighter into your lists for other reasons? Whether he's, this fighter is, say, very expensive and doesn't really do much other than just cast this ability, or if the fighter is really cheap and can go into pretty much any warband. Those things matter. It matters where you have to deploy your fighter to get the most out of this ability, stuff like that. Those matter quite a bit when I'm evaluating abilities. And then the last is counterplay. Sort of how easy is it for your opponent to stop you from using this to its fullest? Warcry is actually pretty low on ability counterplay. One of the few ways to deal with an opponent's dice abilities is to just get initiative from them and use your dice first, which is not super counterplay-ish. There's no such thing as like a counter spell in Warcry or anything like that. There's no what would you call it, unbinds in Age of Sigmar, right? We don't have anything like that. So counterplay can be pretty difficult, but it is really important to be using it when you can. And, for some abilities where they come off of just a very, very weak, not necessarily weak in terms of overall power level, but weak in terms of how easy it is to kill. If they come out of a weak fighter, sometimes the opponent can have some real counterplay there by just focusing down that fighter first. So let's talk about kind of the going rate for doubles to help you maybe evaluate your own before I go into the ones that are really crazy out of bounds here. For just pure damage output, I would say if you can get an expected value, sort of an average damage value of 4 out of a double, then that's kind of reasonable. And the way I got to that number is if you do Onslaught on a Strength 6, 3/5 damage profile, you create EV 2.33 out of 1 attack, or 4.66 out of 2 attacks. Now, before you tell me, hey, you never deal 2.33 damage, it's just a shortcut to tell you about how often you get 3 damage out of it, how often you get 0, how often you get 6 damage out of it, etc. You're never going to get 6 out of Onslaught on 1 attack, but like how often you get 3, how often you get 5, and how often you get 0. Most of the time you're going to get 3 out of that Onslaught, but not every time, right? And doing it twice, sometimes you'll get 5, sometimes you'll get 6, sometimes you'll get 10, almost never. Or sometimes you'll still only get 0, and sometimes you'll get 3, right? So the point being that those average out to 4.66, and that can kind of tell you your quote unquote expected value. Onslaught, when you're sort of gearing up for 2 attacks, feels really powerful on big, expensive fighters. Obviously, there's bigger damage profiles than this, though Order doesn't really have them. Order is pretty low on the damage output of their fighters. But, Destruction, Chaos, they have a really easy time getting to much bigger numbers than this. But that's part of what just makes, not so much Chaos right now, though their issues are different, but part of what makes Destruction so good right now is that they, Destruction is the best Grand Alliance, and they combo with Onslaught better than any other Grand Alliance, and it's not close. And Onslaught is the sort of base double that kind of dictates the entire game, right? And so I wouldn't say that your doubles need to be as good as Onslaught is in Destruction, but I would say that they need to be, as good as Onslaught is in Order, right? And Order has a really easy time getting to 3/5 damage profiles. And so Onslaught there is kind of a real benchmark to be shooting for. You're usually somewhat disappointed if you're using it on just 1 attack, but you still do it. And you're feeling pretty good if you use it on 2 attacks. So you want to at least be close. If you're just taking an ability just for the damage, you want to at least be close to that 4 range. However, one thing to kind of think about is that damage at longer range is better, right? That Onslaught attack is really only going for, if you do it on a Protector Prime, that's pretty good, and that's, 3-inch range. But anything more than that is doing something that Onslaught just can't do, which makes it much, much better, right? Now for movement, the real benchmark here is Rush, because it gives 2 inches over 2 activations. So anything that's 3 inches of movement or more is kind of above that universal sort of benchmark, which is nice, right? The issue with all movement abilities is what is the payload we're delivering, right? And we'll get way more into movement abilities when we get to the triples, because that's where most of the good movement is in this game. But for a 3-inch move, are we getting a bunch of fighters over there? Are we getting a big fighter over there? These kinds of things really matter. Then we've got actions. 1 is kind of the going rate for actions on a double. Usually you'll have to jump through a hoop to get to it, and how high or how narrow the hoop is, how difficult that hoop is to jump through, basically dictates how good those bonus actions are. In general, bonus actions tend to be the most powerful doubles in every Grand Alliance, not just Order, but it does matter, and they're not all sort of built the same. Last, we have disruption. And if 1 is the going rate for actions, and those bonus actions are really good on a double, then it stands to reason that if you can remove an action from your opponent for the cost of a double, that is incredibly powerful. Now, a lot of them will have kind of an EV of less than 1 action. For example, you'll have a % chance to fail. But if you do manage to take away an action from your opponent, or even better, 2 actions from your opponent, with just a double, that's incredibly powerful and really good. So things like nets or objective stealing work for that. So now let's get into specifics, right? And the number one thing, like I kind of mentioned before, the best thing you can be doing with a double, in Order at least, is generally, there is going to be one exception I'll talk about later, but is generally going to be bonus actions. And Order has a ton of ways to get bonus actions on a double. I counted 7, but if I missed one, let me know. Now, not all of them, like I said before, are created equal. So the biggest thing that I kind of look for in a bonus action is whether your bonus action can become any type of action. So for an example here, Blazing Impetus, which I didn't put on screen, but it is a bonus double from Vulcan Flameseekers, which are a faction I absolutely adore. But it only comes after you've made 2 move actions. So you go move, move, and then another 3-inch, you can either move or disengage from it, which is really cheeky, being able to do the bonus disengage where you move onto someone and then you bounce off of them onto an objective. It is a very powerful ability. It is very good, but it is not necessarily game defining in any way, because there's no way for you to turn that bonus move into an attack action, right? You can't go move, Blazing Impetus, and then attack, and then your bonus move created an attack for you and created damage for you. If you compare that to Thundering Strides, pick another friendly fighter within 6 inches of this fighter. That fighter makes a bonus move action. Incredibly simple, a pretty long range. 6 inches is a lot in Warcry. And that fighter gets to make a bonus move, but then you can move them into combat with something, and then they get 2 attack actions. You can just move them forward onto something and then sort of wait a while before you commit to anything. There's just a lot you can do with Thundering Strides, and you can turn it into attack actions. You can turn it into wait actions too. So for example, you could wait with a bunch of fighters, and then you could use your double Thundering Strides to then move one of the fighters you waited with, so that it then moves again and gets 2 move actions like normal, but it also waited, right? So you can really get any type of action. Hard to get a disengage out of Thundering Strides, but other than that, you can get any type of action out of Thundering Strides, even though it says move, and that is incredibly powerful. Storm of Justice is similar. Again, can't get a disengage out of it, but otherwise, right, you can get a wait out of it. You can explicitly get a move or an attack, which is incredibly powerful. You are kind of limited by the value of the ability, so you don't have the 6-inch range, but it's easy to get high doubles, so you can easily have 4, 5, 6-inch range, which should be pretty easy for you to get. These are absolutely the 2 most powerful action doubles in the game. Now, Storm of Justice is a little bit tough to use because it's faction locked to Black Talons. And Black Talons just have some really heavy list building restrictions that make them difficult to use, where they really can't get a lot of numbers. So, for example, I talked about how Thundering Strides can turn into weight actions. Storm of Justice, it's hard to really turn it into weight actions because you can't really afford to wait in Black Talons, right? So it's just less flexible just by virtue of how much less flexible Black Talons are, just by the composition of their warband, of their entire faction. And so, I wouldn't put this as one of the top ones to watch out for, but if you play Black Talons, you are going to notice this ability. It is going to be incredibly powerful. It is the thing that helps them keep up. It is the ability that makes Black Talon sort of competent in the game, and it's no coincidence that Thundering Strides also belongs to a warband that is Stormcast, that is only 6 fighters, right? So those two are kind of top of the heap. I kind of mentioned Blazing Impetus because it's sort of at the bottom of the heap of the bonus action doubles. But the ones in between I think are interesting too. So it really matters sort of the conditions that go into triggering your bonus action and then your flexibility of what you can get out of it, right? So the first one is there are 3 action on kill abilities in Warcry for Order on a double. Lots of qualifications there, but the first is Cold-Blooded Commander, then there's Shock and Awe, and then there's Cleanse the Realms of Taint. What a name. They are all the same wording as famously Blood for the Blood God. That's kind of the one that everybody compares them all to. It's the same wording on all of them, but if you take down an enemy fighter, you get a bonus move or attack action. These are almost impossible to turn into weights because you have to do a thing to trigger it. And sometimes they can be difficult to turn into bonus attacks as well. So, for example, if you are in combat with an enemy fighter and it takes you 2 attacks to kill it, you won't be able to turn that double into more damage. What you'll do is you'll turn it to move somewhere, which might be nice, but it also kind of might leave you exposed if you try to move onto an enemy fighter to then get more damage next round out of that, right? That's kind of the closest you can get to turning this bonus action into damage, but doing that can be risky. Your dream, of course, is you get somewhere, you kill something in 1 attack, and then you just come up, you get to move and then attack something else, or you get to, say, for example, you attack, kill something, proc the ability, use it, and then you're already in combat with something, and then you get to use it as an attack. So thinking about the ways that it works like that, the reason sort of that kind of puzzle is why I would say Cold-Blooded Commander is the best one of them, because it can go on the Slan Starmaster, which can hunt out sort of already weakened fighters to make sure it gets kills, to make sure that it just gets that double, to then it can then move or attack really easily because it has that range. So it's able to kind of get a lot from that. So you can turn this double into sort of damage anywhere on the board. It's really easy to confirm because you can hunt out already weakened fighters. So it's really by far the most flexible of them, not because of the wording of the ability. They all have the same wording, but just because of the fighter you're using it on. For that same reason, I would really put Shock and Awe as number 2 here, mostly just because Annihilator Primes with Grand Hammer can get it. The Annihilator Prime with Grand Hammer has 2-inch range, which improves your odds of being able to be somewhere where you can sort of have multiple fighters in your attack range. It also is very good at killing if you give it a sort of +1 attack blessing, Divine Blessing. You can get a crazy amount of damage out of it. It normally has 4 attacks on 6 strength, 3s and 5s. The blessing gives it 5 attacks, 3s and 5s, and so now you can often kill stuff without having to use dice. One of the big issues on melee fighters that have this ability is you're often in situations where you're worried you need to use your dice to confirm the kill, and so then if you do that, you won't be able to use your bonus action ability. Well, Annihilator Prime can put itself in a lot of situations where it doesn't have to use bonus dice to confirm a kill and has the luxury of then using Shock and Awe to use the already confirmed kill to then take something else out as well. So it's kind of like the rich get richer with these action on kill abilities, and so you want them on factions that are already really rich. And so that's why Cold Blooded Commander and Shock and Awe are the best of them. Finally, Furious Avengers. This is the ability out of Stormcast Warrior Chamber where you can. It's actually kind of cool. You basically get a free movement as long as there is an injured fighter within 6 inches of you, but it doesn't have to be towards your injured ally. So you can basically, you just get angry if somebody's been hurting your friends. This is a really interesting ability. It's really powerful, but it does impose some list building restrictions on you. You have to have fighters in your warband that don't just get taken out in one hit. You have to kind of have these extended engagements. Otherwise, Furious Avengers won't necessarily do that much. And it doesn't really do much within the confines of combat itself very often. It's more about moving around the board. Now, you can turn it into damage really easily. For example, if you have 2 fighters who are in an extended combat, it's really easy to have one of your warrior chamber guys kind of get over there from quite a ways away. And a lot of warrior chamber has like 2-inch reach, stuff like that, sometimes even 3-inch reach if you're playing protectors, which I think are really good. You can kind of get over from really far away and get damage into an already extended fight and help, turn a 1v1 into a 2v1 that you then win, stuff like that. So Furious Avengers is really good. I would say it's, all 7 of the abilities on this screen are incredible. Thundering Strides is definitely the best one, but after that, you could really argue anything with Cold Blooded Commander, Furious Avengers, and Storm of Justice, I think. And then Shock and Awe is just barely behind them. Now let's get into just pure damage doubles. And there are way more of these in order than there are action doubles. Action doubles, I think there's just 7. Now, I'm sure I missed one. Let me know. There's going to be one, Low Tide, that people are going to talk to me about that I don't count. Blazing Impetus probably shouldn't count either, but those are all of them, and they are all extremely relevant. Damage doubles, I'm less convinced. So for example, there's a few here that are pretty popular that I didn't include, like Bathe in Blood or Blazing Weapons or Ignite Weapons. Sorry, there are a few that I didn't include that are decent, that are worth that shout out. But man, there's even more that are just not good at all. If there's not a dozen, if there's not 2 dozen, there's at least a dozen just regular damage doubles in order. But I think there's 3 that really stand out. And so I want to talk about comparing damage doubles to bonus actions, because bonus actions can turn into damage if they just turn into an attack action. And so that can be kind of a tough comparison to any kind of damage double. And why most damage boosts I'm not that into. So for example, if it's just all I'm doing is improving my melee damage amount, that's not that exciting. Now, the best of them are good. So for example, Ignite Weapons, again, has an EV of 4.3. I said before, the number you need to count to is 4 for EV. It does give you sort of an effect on just 1 attack. So Onslaught on 2 attacks really produces about the same amount that Ignite Weapons does on just 1 attack, which makes Ignite Weapons really nice and really flexible. It also has a pretty set output no matter who is using it, which is really nice. But in general, those damage boosts are usually just sort of worse than bonus actions would be in the same situation. And those bonus actions also just scale if you use them on really big fighters. So Burn, if it's good. Now, a lot of Burn abilities just don't have a very high output and so aren't that good. But Burn, when it is good, is better than a damage boost. And I think the top 3 here, there are a few that are really solid. Like there's one in Seraphon where the Skink Priest has it. There's a few of these that are playable, but the 2 that I think are really impressive are Explosive Bolts and Thunderous Blast. And the one that I've seen just be really consistent over the course of games is Bolt from the Heavens. So I'll start with Explosive Bolts. After the next missile attack action made by this fighter, this activation, if it scored 1 or more hits, allocate a number of damage points to each other fighter within 3 inches of the target, equal to half the value of this ability. There's a lot of counting there, but basically you shoot something, and if you get a hit but not a crit, crits don't count for this, but if you just get a hit, you just get to explode damage everywhere. So now, before we get too into this, I'm pretty sure when they designed this, they meant for crits to count. However, in their FAQs, they have been really clear that crits and hits are different entities and have different language for each. But I'm like 99% sure that whoever wrote this rule meant for crits to count. All I would say is just like, if you rolled a 6, the bolt just goes right through, so it never explodes, right? That's the only thing I can come up with here. But basically, this is an ability. It's only on Quiet Pock, but 75% chance for kind of 6-ish damage versus toughness 3. But you can boost that to a strength blessing to make that 75 apply to toughness 4. 56% for even toughness and strength, and then 31% if they've got higher toughness than your strength. The reason that doesn't really matter much is that you can always just target the lowest toughness fighter in a neighborhood. So if an opponent wants to counterplay your Explosive Bolts, they have to have their entire warband be high toughness. They can't even have a single low toughness fighter, or else Explosive Bolts just hits everybody, which is pretty wild and pretty good. It's also, it scales based on how many sort of opponents there are in range of it. So I've done these calculations of kind of 6-ish damage is if you have the ability on 5s or 6s, and then they have 2 things nearby. But if they've got more than 2 nearby, if there's like a big team fight, man, you can get a lot of damage out of Explosive Bolts. Thunderous Blast is it's mostly just impressive because of the output. So if you have 5s or 6s, the EV on Thunderous Blast is 6, which is significantly more than 4. I mean, it's only 2 more than 4, but that is still significant. And one of the things that's significant about it is that Grots have 6 health. And so being able to kill a Grot without doing an attack, without wasting an action for it, by just like kill a Grot by just spending a double and that's it, is pretty amazing. It also gives you a pretty reasonable chance of counting to 9, which all of a sudden, if you're killing 8 wound fighters on just a double with no attack actions, that's pretty incredible. So Thunderous Blast can give you sort of pretty good odds at just like deleting a single fighter for just the cost of a double against a lot of different warbands. And so much the same way Explosive Bolts just like throws so much damage onto hordes, Thunderous Blast can really pick out that one support chaff that your opponent was really relying on, whether it's like their netter that was in the back, or just someone who is there to sort of cast an important spell, or just like use wait actions to change the sequencing of a turn. Thunderous Blast can completely ruin that. And one thing that's nice about burn compared to damage boosts is that you can split and have your attack go to one fighter and then your burn go to something else. So, for example, your opponent can't body block you from being able to Thunderous Blast. So if they try to hide their little squishy fighter behind something tougher, you can still get forced to fight the tough thing, but you can then put your Thunderous Blast onto the squishy fighter to maybe just kill it with just a double, and get a ton of value out of your fighter, even if you end up losing the 1v1, which you just wouldn't be able to do with a damage boost. So that makes it pretty good. Last is Bolt from the Heavens, which is really amazing because at 18-inch range, the EV is 4.5, but again, when we talk about this, you have a 1 in 8 chance of whiffing. You have a 3 in 8 chance of dealing 3 damage, 3 in 8 chance of dealing 6 damage, and 1 in 8 chance of dealing 9 damage. The reason I kind of put that little bell curve there for you is because this is something where at 18-inch range on the Knight Arcanum, you can just kind of like be doing something completely different and just besiege one part of the battlefield that your opponent needs to have safe. So a lot of games will have like a home objective or like a treasure carrier that you're trying to keep safe that just will never be safe if you are facing a Knight Arcanum. A lot of quarters missions, if you've ever played a game like No Quarter, which is in the core book, where you split the battlefield into quarters, it makes running away really powerful. You often want to put like your cheapest fighter and run them to one of the corners of the battlefield. And a Knight Arcanum can just point to that fighter and say, you might have it here, but I guarantee by the end of round 4 that thing's going to be dead because I'm just going to keep rolling doubles at it, and eventually one of these doubles is going to be a 6 or a 9, and then it's just going to be gone. You're going to average, if you pick the same fighter every single time, you're going to deal 15, 18, or 21 to it over the course of 4 rounds. Just like almost every time you're going to, like almost every game, you're going to end up with an output of one of those 3 options of 15, 18, or 21. And so that's just a pretty good promise that you can make to your opponent that you're just going to go kill whatever thing they're trying to create safety for, which really changes how the game ends up playing out. And then you combine that with the fact that she can just be shooting things at 7-inch range that are, other problems. So she can kind of project damage into multiple places at once. She's also got this melee attack that's like not great, but it's not that embarrassing. So if you just like run something little up to her to just kind of try to stop her shooting, she'll just keep killing whatever little thing you ran up to her, and then she'll still be bolting from the heavens whatever it is she's aiming at. So the Knight Arcanum is kind of eclipsed in Thunderstrike just because the Annihilator Prime is there, Calthea Zandire is there, but man, there's a lot of factions in the game that would kill to have Knight Arcanum as their leader instead of what they've got instead. Mainly like every first edition bespoke faction would kill to have Knight Arcanum instead of what they've got, but I digress. Let's get to movement doubles. And movement abilities, I'm really going to talk about more when we get to triples, but movement doubles are worth talking about. So Rush kind of sets this bar at 2 inches over 2 actions. That's not a ton of movement, but you use it. I mean, when I don't have a warband with any good movement abilities, I do use Rush fairly often. But what matters the most is what payload you're delivering. And so this is kind of the issue with Order. So for example, Fire Slayers have an ability called Relentless Zeal. And it is worded exactly the same as on the Maw Path. And Slanesh has this ability too, but I'm blanking on what it's called. On the Maw Path is +3 movement on your next attack action, but it's on Ogre Maw Tribes. And ogres have these giant 280 point ogres that just like melt whatever they touch the second they look at it. Fire Slayers doesn't have anyone like that, right? Fire Slayers fighters cost half as much as an ogre, and they deal a quarter as much damage. They basically do nothing. So when you do Relentless Zeal on them, it's still nice when you need to get from place to place, but you're not like delivering some massive payload. You're not delivering a third of your warband in terms of points onto a spot to then go fight. Riverblades has kind of an interesting double that kind of suffers the same issue where they just don't have anything impressive that you're kind of throwing around the battlefield while also doing 1 or 2 damage. So there's only a couple here that really matter in Order. And the one that I would really pick is Aether Force, because the bonus survivability matters and the things that you're transporting are pretty big. So Aether Force is until the end of the battle round, add 1 to the toughness characteristic of this fighter and 2 to the move characteristic of this fighter. So you're getting double rush and you're getting a toughness for it, which is actually just kind of an absurd amount of output compared to like similar things in the game. It's significantly more over 2 attack actions than Relentless Zeal is, right? But even over just 1, like if you just want to go get into a fight, you can take a move 4 fighter, bring it to move 6, go into a fight, and now you're more tough in that fight than you normally would be. So you're actually not that worried about whether you ran straight into something that is already activated or not. You might not mind if you just deal 1 attack to it, take 2 back, and then, see what happens later. So Aether Force is really incredible. Another one that's kind of good, I kind of put or low tide, maybe the Vulcan Flame Seekers, Blazing Impetus should be in this same thing. But low tide is here because you get basically a bonus move action equal to the value of the dice, but it's only in round 1. So it's really difficult to convert low tide into anything other than just that movement. It's really difficult to convert it into other damage this round, especially because the one fighter that it would be really busted on is, I'm just going to completely ruin this the continuity of this video, but the Achillean King is who you would really want to use it on, and you can, and it's fine. But the Achillean King really asks you to hold a double for it to have its best damage output because of Storm of Blows, and so it's kind of a non-bow there with the Achillean King. And so sure, like you can use it to get eels into combat, but eels are already pretty fast. You're not that worried about it. Low tide would make this list if any of the foot Idoneth heroes were really good, but at the moment, none of them are really exciting or something you really are happy to play. So you're not really going to use it much. So it doesn't really make it, even though on rate it's really. So I recorded most of this video before the last FAQ, and wow, one of the factions that came out in the last FAQ was the Ruination Chamber. They finally updated Scaventide into the game, and the rate on Memories of Past Glories, which is the double for Ruination Chamber Reclusians, is really incredible. So it's only +1 move, but that's what qualifies it for this section, but it's +1 to 3 strength. But the thing that makes that really good is how it combos with the stat profile of Reclusians. They only have strength 4, but they have 3 damage, 5 crit, and 4 attacks. So if you manage to go from hitting on 5s to hitting on 3s, so against toughness 5, toughness 6, something like that, the improvement that it allows for you is wild. It's like basically their DPA 5 is 5.33, their DPA 3 is 9.33. That's an EV of 4 when you sort of use this double, but it's even better because you combo with the battle trait. The battle trait lets you drop down deep strike anywhere within 5 inches of your opponent, but you have to be outside of 5 inches from your opponent. But the double gives you, because they have move 4, that it gives you the +1 move to get into combat. Then you get to attack. It's really incredible. It is the perfect combo with stat line and with battle trait that you could ever ask for. It completely changes the face of Ruination Chamber. I don't think I'm quite willing to put it in the top 5 abilities doubles in order, but it is really good. And who knows, maybe somewhere down the road I'll change my mind on, top 5 status. But it is incredibly good, and it makes me take back what I said about movement abilities being only relevant here for triples. Solid. Finally, we have the control doubles, and the defining one of them is Over My Dead Body. That's just +2 to OBSEC. Until the end of the battle round, this fighter counts as 2 additional fighters when determining which player controls an objective. So any objective that's determined by the number of fighters within 3 inches of it, Over My Dead Body is going to just, not every time, but almost every time, just take it. And one way I like to think about Over My Dead Body is that you cancel all the actions of the fighters that have moved to that objective thus far this game, right? Because now none of those move actions mattered because you have taken this objective anyway. It's pretty wild when you think of it that way, when we say that one action is kind of the going rate in order, and Over My Dead Body can cancel like 2 or 3 actions pretty easily. Shrieking Terror is also very good. It's a 66% chance at a net. When you do net something, so pick a visible enemy fighter within a number of inches of this fighter equal to the value of this ability and roll a dice. On a 3-up, that fighter cannot make move or disengage actions. It's nice that it's long range sometimes so that you can get it from really far away. if you do make it so that they're not in combat with anything and then they can't move, um, you've removed 2 actions from your opponent, essentially. I mean, you've turned 2 actions into 2 wait actions, essentially, right? And so a 66% chance of removing 2 actions is just an incredible rate, and it's why nets are kind of the core control thing that happens in Warcry. I actually wish it wasn't this way. I wish nets were not costed so effectively compared to how like damage reduction stuff is costed. So, for example, Castellite Formation and Grim Last Stand, I think are both pretty interesting abilities. They can be a little annoying to play with against, which I think is why they're not costed effectively or efficiently. But they're interesting and they're kind of fun to kind of build the castle. And it's only a 3-inch bubble, so it's not taking up that much of the board, right? Though that's not what we've got. Both of those are fairly expensive in terms of like what you pay for the fighters that have access to it. And so they end up not necessarily dominating the game the way these other 2 control doubles are. All 4 of them, though, I think are pretty reasonable and something you can absolutely build a warband around. That gets me to the final list. I counted, I think, 13 doubles I talked about that really matter. Maybe 15 if you want to say that these control honorable mentions count as well. But I wanted to just like dig into a top 5 to make sure that I really get the point across of how good these are and how they can matter in your games. So the first is Over My Dead Body. I think that's the best double in order. You get 2 additional obsec out of it. The costs in your list are incredibly low, right? For 115 points to 145, you can bring in an ally that can do this ability, which is just wild. It's extremely easy setup. All you have to do is get onto an objective and hopefully like hide as far away from your opponent as you can. And then you just set this up. There's very little counterplay you can do against when it's coming out in faction, because what Dispossessed can do is they can just wait 4 or 5 times and then they can just put Over My Dead Body on whichever objective is going to matter the most, which is wild because they get to watch the game develop with their chaff and then do it. And so you just can't counterplay it. When you do Over My Dead Body as an ally coming in, it's not quite as oppressive because you do have to be a little bit more proactive with how you use it because it's a much more expensive piece that's doing it. You probably don't want to just like wait a bunch every round with a 145 point ally because you're giving up a lot of value that way. So it plays out very differently in faction than it does as an ally, but it's very good in both situations because the ally cost is so low and the in-faction sort of flexibility is so high. This is absolutely a meta-defining ability right now in Warcry, in both situations, in faction and as an ally. I already talked about it kind of negating opposing actions, but again, when you think about that going rate of a double equals an action, Over My Dead Body is just wild, the amount of actions that you can invalidate by just popping this ability. So it's really crazy. If it's not the best double in the game, it's pretty close. But the one real cost to it is it does nothing in 50% of games, right? Because not every game has objectives. Only about half the games usually have objectives, and so that is one cost to it, right? So if you are going to build a warband that's relying on Over My Dead Body, you want to make sure that you are pretty strong in the other games that aren't necessarily objective missions. And I think you want to focus on those types of missions sort of as your primary focus. But this kind of just lets you know that you're going to win the objectives and then go focus on those missions, which is really powerful. The next is Thundering Strides. I really think it's the second best ability in order. This is one where the best doubles in other factions, I do think, eclipse Thundering Strides, but it's still very, very good. It's a really easy setup because it's 6-inch range. It's on a pretty survivable body, toughness 5, 20 wounds, at 160 to 70 points for the fighters that have access to it. That's a ally that has some real cost to it, but it's still pretty easy to fit into lists. The only list building cost is if you want to get really broken with it, and apply this ability to like massive 250 point allies, that is where the points start to add up pretty quickly, and you want to make sure that you're just in a faction that can handle that, because you're probably going to want to put them in deployment groups that are at least going to be near each other, if not in the same deployment group, which kind of has a skewing effect on how you end up deploying the rest of your warband. Either way, though, it's very, very powerful. I've been playing a little bit, actually, kind of a lot of it with questers over the summer, and I just find them so good just to have one. I still don't think Quester Soulsworn are very good, but Thundering Strides, just as an ally, is incredible. I think it's amazing. It's so easy to translate this move action into damage because of the way you can just get something into combat range, the way you can just like use this as the very last thing you do in a turn or as the very first, and like either way it's really powerful. The only real counterplay your opponent has is that you have a lag between when you use it on your quester and then when the thing that you've moved gets to act again. But I've a bunch of times attacked with something where my opponent like body blocked my leader from getting onto an objective, and so I double attacked, killed the thing, but then wasn't on the objective, and then I used my quester to then move the leader onto the objective, something like that. So I've done that multiple times. I think it's really powerful. So just the ways you can get creative with Thundering Strides are really amazing. Cold-Blooded Commander is really only here because of the Slan Star Master. There's very, very high cost to using this in terms of you have to make a lot of list building compromises to fit the frog into your list, because it's 285 points once you've blessed it with strength. But if you do that, there are certain warbands that can literally just never beat a frog. It's pretty wild, right? Just the things that the frog can do, the way it just like blows up chaff so quickly, and the way that Cold-Blooded Commander allows it to just outpace even the sort of most like swarmy of swarm warbands. You could bring 15 fighters, a frog is still going to take those fighters out of the game, and that's just such a rough place to be. And so that makes Cold-Blooded Commander so good. There are some warbands that just like shrug off the frog, like certain Iron Jaws setups just don't care because 15 wound, toughness 5 Ard boys just like don't care that there's a frog there. But when the frog wins, the frog wins. When it loses, it loses. I find it that it makes matchups very polarizing, but there's just certain warbands that can just never deal with it, which makes it number 3 on this list. Number 4, I'd go with Furious Avengers. The costs to running this are kind of a little bit more medium. Like, you do have significant list building costs. Warrior Chamber is good, but it is very specific in how it plays. It doesn't really have a lot of other options to it. You have to also, if you want to sort of port this out of Warrior Chamber as an ally, you have to put it somewhere where you're going to have fighters who get hurt but without dying. So, for example, I've run a Decimator Prime in Quadrant Overlords, and it was just okay, but sometimes your dwarves will just like get one-shot killed by something, and then you never get an opportunity to use Furious Avengers. So that can be a little bit tough, but when your opponent is having to take multiple attacks to kill your fighters, Furious Avengers is just amazing because you'll have options all over the board. It's also very, very good in round 3 specifically, because I find often if you get your big, Decimator or Protector Prime or whatever, your Paladin into combat in round 2, it'll often, or like at the end of round 1, it'll often clear what it fights in round 2 or maybe round 3, and then that's when there's going to be fighters all over the place that are damaged but not dead, and then that's when you get to move in round 3 to then set up a new fight for round 4, because a lot of the time what can happen with those big Warrior Chamber Paladins is they can kind of get stuck where they win their fight in one spot, but then that's not enough to win the game. They need to get somewhere else to put their damage somewhere else, and that's what Furious Avengers is so good at, is in round 3 specifically. Last is Explosive Bolts, just the way that you can put so much damage out just the next town over is so silly. It's incredibly good. It kind of nearly invalidates Horde Warbands. A lot of the best horde fighters have kind of been nerfed anyway, but which does kind of lower explosive bolts. I think I'd consider switching it with Furious Avengers if we were still in kind of the chaff meta that we used to be in. But as is, it's still really good. It can still contribute to team fights really well. So, for example, a lot of the time you really want to put some damage onto something, but you can't because it's in combat. But if that thing has any friends that are nearby that aren't in combat, you can shoot its friends and then still get damage onto it without hurting your ally because of explosive bolts. So that just is an incredibly powerful and an incredibly flexible ability. And the cool thing is, Quiet Pock, even though he's not a hero, he's still allyable because of Underworlds, and because Haskell, Hexbane, and Dogs don't suck. So you really don't mind putting that like package of 3 or 4 fighters into a separate warband because the other pieces, the other taxes that you have to include, really just don't feel that bad, and so you get to be in this really powerful place. Ooh, that turned out a little bit longer than I meant for it to, but that's how Order is. There's so much in Order. I actually planned on making this video for all the abilities in Order, bar none, like just every single, like all the best abilities, and there were just way too many. So if you aren't interested in this series, if you're interested in how it's going to go as I kind of expand to the triples in Order, and then I should be able to do the doubles and the triples in Death and Destruction, each as their own Grand Alliance, and then I'll probably split doubles and triples for Chaos again. But if you're interested in this series, let me know in the comments like what abilities you think could sort of deserved to be on this list, what abilities you don't think deserved, or join the Patreon if you're interested in kind of chatting about it more and longer with me. So until I get to all the other, I set myself up to need, 5 more videos to complete this, but until I get to those, may all your rolls be crits.